The age of consent was set at 16 in the 19th century. I think it's now, more than 100 years later, time to do a review, based on the fact that the average age of first sexual experience is now 14. An age of consent of 16 is unrealistic. And also, of course, very importantly, it criminalises young people engaged in consenting sexual acts with other people of the same ages. You know, we're not talking about adults having sex with children. That's totally wrong. But we're talking about young people of similar ages. One option might be to keep the age of consent at 16, but have a policy of not prosecuting sex involving young people under 16, providing there's no more than, say, 2 or 3 years difference in their ages. The kind of system they have in Switzerland, Israel, and some other countries.
And actually the system that we de facto have here, because although you're right that the age of consent is currently 16, the Crown Prosecution Service, whose job it is to decide when a prosecution is in the public interest, actually are really clear that when two people are the same age, it will generally be extremely unlikely that they would prosecute unless there is a suggestion that one has been exploited and coerced. So if you look at the way that the law actually works in practice, there is an attempt to capture that nuance, and that's why we don't have legions of 15-year-olds and 14-year-olds on the sex offenders register. Obviously that does then create a sort of a lack of clarity, arguably, but I think we need a lot more evidence that that's doing harm before we made such a significant change to a law that is, after all, designed to protect children. It's not there to criminalise them. I think a better emphasis for those who want to make sure that children are aware of their rights and are empowered to make informed decisions is, of course, to focus on sex education, which I know is something that we would probably agree on.
Better quality, earlier sex education is absolutely vital, and I would not support any change in the age of consent unless that was brought into play. On the point about young people largely not being affected by this, you're right, the numbers are small. Prosecutions are very small, cautions less so. There are more cautions, and some of those people who are cautioned are put on the sex offenders register for sexual relationships with young people of the same age or similar age. It's usually because parents don't like the person their son or daughter is going out with. They ask them to stop, they won't, and so therefore they bring in the police, and the other partner ends up getting prosecuted.
Well, there still has to be evidence in those cases, so I think we'd need to be sure that that cautions are not being given because actually there is a suggestion coming from the victim, arguably, not necessarily the parents. It doesn't matter who it comes from, there still has to be objective evidence. Yep. I think there is a real problem with adults, and this is something that the Office of the Children's Commissioner have recently published a major report on after a 2-year inquiry. There is a real problem with adults coming to terms with the fact that it's not just older people who are predatory towards young people. Predatory attitudes between teenagers are actually widespread. Sexist attitudes, bullying, were found in that report to exist across the country. So that layer of protection is as important between people of the same age, young people of the same age, as it is in a case where there's a much older sexual predator.
Yeah, any form of sexual grooming, predatory behaviour, sexual exploitation or abuse, that's totally wrong in all circumstances, no matter who does it. But I think, you know, for me the big problem is that even if the number of cautions and prosecutions is low, when sex involves young people of similar ages under the age of consent, it sends a very wrong signal. It sends the signal that these young people are criminals. In fact, in law, they have the status of unapprehended criminals.
So if the argument is that the age of consent is so high that it is risking criminalising lots of young people, even though I would argue that in practice it's not, what do you think a more appropriate age would be?
I think, given that the average age of consent is now 14 is probably more realistic. Although I wouldn't encourage young people to have sex at that age. It's best if they wait. But if they do, they shouldn't be labelled by the law as criminals. Another option might be to have a system whereby sex involving young people under 16 would not be prosecuted, providing there's, say, only 2 years difference in their ages. So that would protect young people from older predatory paedophiles.
We've already got a better version of the system that you suggest. And then I think when we talk about lowering the age of consent to 14 and the signal that that would send about young people that age to older people, even though it would remain illegal for them, I still think it would send a signal about the sexual availability of young people that would be far too dangerous for society to even contemplate without further evidence that we're actually doing harm, that we are actually criminalising young people on anything like the sort of scale that you suggest.